Hello everyone, my name is Alec Christie and today I'd like to talk to you about publication delays in conservation. Now, first of all, I'm going to start by saying that this is a joint project between myself and Tom White, and we're both PhD students at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Zoology and the Conservation Evidence Group. So what is publication delay? So we're defining this as the time taken from finishing your data collection to publishing your study. And the best way to visualize this is on a timeline. So let's imagine you've just finished collecting data. Now, what you're going to do is hopefully do some analysis and write up your findings, and then you'll submit to your journal, the journal that you've chosen. And that is going to be called your write-up delay. And if you're lucky and you're great at what you do, then you will get your papers published and accepted in that first journal. But very often we're going to have to reformat, resubmit our studies to different journals. And that's all going to take time until the studies eventually reach the journal they will be published in. And this is called the resubmission delay. And in total, the write-up delay plus the resubmission delay is going to be called the submission delay. So it's the amount of time that it's taken for you to finish your study to when it gets to the journal that it will be published in. Once it's at that journal, there'll be some obviously peer review and editing before it's finally published. And that's going to be called your journal delay. And if we add those together, so the submission delay and the journal delay, we're going to come up with the overall publication delay. So the amount of time it's taken for you to publish your study after finishing the data collection. And why does this matter? So clearly conservation is a mission-driven discipline. And what we're really interested in conservation is getting research out and rapidly disseminated so that we can improve future conservation efforts and inform practice and policy. And we're racing against time to stop species going extinct and habitats being lost. So this timely dissemination of research is really important against this ticking clock. So to quantify these delays, we set out to investigate this in the literature that quantitatively tests conservation interventions. And findings from these studies, which you can think of as solution studies, are really important, as we said, to improve and make conservation practice and policy more efficient and effective in the future. So to do this, we focused on the Conservation Evidence Database, and that's got over 6,000 unique studies across several thousand different conservation interventions. And these studies have been summarized and collated by a research group called Conservation Evidence, using a standardized format of searching journals and extracting studies that are testing conservation interventions. And the database, so on the website, the database looks like this, and underlying it is a database where studies are tagged with different various sources of metadata. And what we do have is the publication date for these studies, but what we needed was when the study ended. And what the research group does is Conservation Evidence summarizes each of those studies. So here you can see there's a paragraph for each study, and it details the date in which the study was conducted. So we'll have the study start and the study end dates. So what we needed to do was use text mining to find those study end dates, and then we could then calculate the publication delay. So that's the difference between the year the study was published and the year the study ended. And luckily we could get all of that from using those methods and from that database. But clearly there's some limitations to what we've done, and we're going to be upfront about those. So of course we're only going to consider a coarse definition of publication delay. So if you think back to that timeline, we're going to include write-up, resubmission and journal delay when we take the difference between those years. And so you'd need further research to kind of disentangle those different types of delays. And unfortunately, because we're taking the difference between years, we'll also overestimate some of the delays. So if a study's published within 12 months, but in a different calendar year, we're actually going to overestimate how long it was delayed. But we're also going to underestimate delays for studies that are published in the same year, the same calendar year. So something that was a study that was ended in January, but published in December of the same year, is actually going to show a 0-year delay. But hopefully those two overestimates and underestimates will balance out. But the main issue is that we're missing studies that are yet to be published, and those are going to have long delays. So really what we think is that our results will show will be an underestimate. They will be missing these studies that have long delays, and therefore in the future that will actually that would bump up our estimate. So those are important things to bear in mind as we go through. So now let's look at our 4 research questions. And these are, firstly, what is the typical length of publication delay? Second, do studies that test interventions on threatened species have shorter delays than studies that test interventions on non-threatened species? And then third, does the destination of the study affect the delay? So looking at grey literature, so non-peer-reviewed literature versus journals, which is peer-reviewed literature. And have these delays shortened over time? So we'd hope processes are getting more efficient, but has that actually improved and reduced the delays? So first of all, what's the typical length of delay? Well, if we look at the top figure, the grey figure to start with, we can see that the median delay is 3 years across all the different fields of conservation. And then if you go down to the smaller figures in blue, we can see that the delays split between these different fields, these different disciplines of conservation. But generally, the median delay is either 3 years or in some cases 2 years. And in a very particular case, it's 1 year. But in general, the delay is very substantial and it's very worrying. So now, do threatened species studies have shorter delays? And as we move down this figure, we're going from less threatened species to more threatened species. And in general, the median delay does not really change. So the median delay for birds and mammals, you can see, is fairly constant at a median of 3 years. Amphibians, the delay is slightly shorter, but it does seem to decrease for critically endangered species, but it doesn't really change for vulnerable or endangered species. So overall, there's not really any change. We're not prioritizing, we're not publishing studies any faster for threatened species as we might hope we would. And now, so does the publication destination affect the delay? So here we're comparing grey literature, which is non-peer-reviewed studies, versus journals that have impact metrics. And as you can see, the grey literature has a shorter delay. So it's 2 years instead of 3 years for the median value. And so, I mean, that's kind of what we'd expect in many ways, because the grey literature isn't peer-reviewed. It's usually reports or theses and things like that. For the journals, actually, interestingly, we also did a separate analysis and looked at is the delay affected by the impact or the rank of the journal. And what we found was there wasn't really any difference. So that's an interesting kind of side point. But in general, yes, the grey literature has a shorter delay, publication delay. Now, have delays shortened over time? Well, not really. So the overall trend isn't really up or down. And if we zoom in on the studies that have publication delays of less than 20 years, we can see that there's not really, again, any change. The annual median and mean values are really they're variable, but they are fairly, there's no overall trend going on here. So just to summarize that, the delay is substantial. The delay is not shorter for threatened species as we'd hope. The delay is slightly shorter in the grey literature, and that's kind of what we'd expect. And the delay hasn't really reduced over time. There's no real overall trend. And that really is kind of bad news. Some of that is bad news for evidence-based conservation efforts. So that begs the question, what is causing these delays? Well, we know there's limited time and resources for first of all, just analysing and writing up your study. And, that ranges from things like short-term contracts, PhDs and master's students moving on to different projects, and then only later on writing up their results and publishing. Scientists, of course, have lots of other commitments, as do practitioners. And of course, there are, particularly for practitioners, there are relatively few incentives and more disincentives to publish in a rapid way and disseminate your work. So it's often a lower priority task. And of course, submission is a tedious process. And so reformatting and resubmitting to different journals is often quite difficult. So all of this is probably contributing to these delays. And so what can we do to reduce publication delays in general? Well, we can continue to streamline that process, and particularly for practitioners, there are journals like Conservation Evidence Journal and also Ecological Solutions and Evidence as part of Applied Ecology Resources that's run by the BES. And those are great venues for getting practitioners to write easier and more rapidly studies that can be more rapidly published and generated in a simpler way. And another more radical idea is to kind of standardize those set of publication styles so that the resubmission delay time comes down, and we don't have to reformat, change references, change the word limits of our papers to match the journals. So that could be a way forward. And also preprints, of course, are a bit controversial, but they do avoid delays. But we have to be careful about the rigor of the research, because again, it's not peer reviewed and it is grey literature essentially. And of course, we can also bring funders and organisations on board. So rules around publishing findings could help, and enforcing those, and then also backing that up with more resources and longer contracts so that people do have the time after they've done a project to write up and publish and disseminate their findings. And to provide incentives to publish could also be important. So for practitioners, maybe some recognition or awards to get them to do that. And in the future, we think, we were limited a bit in this analysis, but we could do a lot more. So we could look at what the relative contribution, if you go back to that timeline, of the write-up, resubmission and journal delays to that overall publication delay that we were only able to look at here. And what causes each of those? Why are certain parts of that process taking longer? And one way to do that is to survey researchers to find out the route that their studies took. And that ranges from asking them, what journals did you approach, how many, how long did it take to hear back, how much reformatting did you have to do, did you give up in the end, are there studies lying around that are never being published? All of that's really important. So in summary, we found that delays are substantial. They're about 3 years in the evidence for conservation. The delay doesn't really change over time. It's not shorter for threatened species, and it's shorter in the grey literature as we'd expect. Delays are really important, and we need to solve them because the timely dissemination of important findings is really important, particularly for evidence-based conservation. And so scientists, practitioners, journals and funders all need to come together to solve this problem and reduce these delays at each stage of the process. So I'd just like to say thank you all for listening. Do get in touch if you want to know more and help us. Thanks to Tom and the Conservation Evidence Group for their help, and thank you to NERC for my PhD funding. Thank you, everyone.